You think you know how to write a sentence, right? I mean, it's easy. Anybody can do it. But there are levels in mastering the sentence. It's like the difference between knowing how to shoot a basketball and then knowing how to shoot a basketball like Steph Curry. And I really don't care whether you are writing your first book or your 19th book. This 6-step process will elevate your sentence writing. The first step of this process is to look at the sentence before it. Sentences don't exist in isolation. You need sentence variety. So when you look at that previous sentence, you need to figure out whether you're going to pair this sentence with it, meaning echo it in some way, or whether you're going to contrast with it and try to make it as different as possible to create a little more variety. Sentences are really like music, and you have to know what the note before was so you can figure out what the next note should be. Now, if you want a hilariously bad example of sentences not realizing what the previous sentence was, I got one for you. This is from Gary Provost. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. That is a perfect encapsulation of why you need more sentence variety. So from that little passage, what is it demanding? It's demanding a long sentence. A long sentence to break up that rat-a-tat rhythm and give us some variety, some musical flow. So here are 3 quick ways to create a little bit more variety. One that we've kind of already touched on already is length. You want to alternate short with medium with long. 2 is structure. You want to start your sentences in different ways. You don't want them all to be SVO, meaning subject, verb, object. He did this. So look at this example from The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Today, despite Rita's closed face and pressed lips, I would like to stay here in the kitchen. That little word, that little today at the beginning. If you have a little word followed by a comma at the beginning of your sentence and contrasts well with the structure of your other sentences. Another structure strategy is to start with a dependent clause. This one is from Cormac McCarthy's The Road. When he got back, that's not a finished sentence, right? That's the dependent clause right there. The boy was still asleep. And the third idea to create variety is rhythm. Look at this 3-part sentence in Karen Russell's Swamplandia. We'd stare at the sun, grip the grass, hold on to each other in the dark. It really flows off the tongue. It's such a beautifully constructed sentence. So the sentence before it probably shouldn't have a 3-part rhythm, and neither should the sentence after it. Now, I do my best when creating these YouTube videos to make them as concise and as helpful as possible, but obviously I can't fit all of my knowledge into a YouTube video. So if you do want more about sentence variety and everything else I know about sentences, check out my course, How to Write a Splendid Sentence. Link in the comments below for that. The second step in constructing a sentence is cherry pick the verb. A lot of writers pick a verb sort of instinctually, almost like the way AI would do it, right? They're just predicting what is the verb that normally goes in this space. But I say cherry pick for a very specific reason. The idea of cherry picking is you're looking over a number of verbs that you could choose between, and you're being like, that one looks nice. Yes, please. I'm trying to get you to focus more on verb selection because verbs are the little despots of the sentence. There's these little authoritarian rulers that control everything that's going on around them. If you spend a little bit more time picking your verbs deliberately, it's going to pay these outsized dividends in improving your sentences. Here's a few great examples to inspire you. Toni Morrison writes about heavy sunflowers weeping over fences. I love that verb weeping. Now, what's a verb you could have put in there, right? You could have put in there bending, right? Heavy sunflowers bending their way over fences, but it includes this contradiction between, you think of sunflowers being happy and yet weeping makes them seem sad, but it implies that they are bending without actually saying the word bending. It's doing a lot of work, that verb. Here's one from Dracula by Bram Stoker. The fog slithered in from the sea. What's a verb you would normally put in there? The fog drifted in from the sea or crept in from the sea. There's nothing wrong with those verbs, but you get this sense of foreboding and this snake-like connotation from the word slithered. It makes the scene creepier, doesn't it? And here's an example from Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Memories scuttled like roaches when the light snapped on. Scuttled is such a fun verb right there, right? If you were writing the sentence, maybe you would have picked something a little bit simpler, something like scattered or something. But scuttled gives this very peculiar flavor to that sentence. Now, I think there are 2 mistakes when it comes to verbs. One, don't try to get too fancy. Don't try to pull out stuff like bequeath. Just say give, and don't say remunerate when you really mean pay, or use fancy pants language like transpire when you really mean happen. Weeping, slithered, and scuttled are not like $10 words that you can only find in the dictionary. They're like kind of average words. What makes them great is the different contexts that they're used in. We don't normally think of fog slithering. We don't normally think of sunflowers weeping. If you take a normal word and put it in an unusual context, that elevates the verb and it elevates the sentence. And the second mistake is just to try to avoid avoid plain Jane verbs, right? These are the common everyday verbs. They're the first verbs that you think of when you write this sentence. This is stuff like passive verbs, right? Like, it's just not very exciting. Pick strong, active verbs that really light up your sentence. So if you want to see some more great verbs, I would recommend checking out my article on the 100 most beautiful sentences ever written. Oh, there are some doozies in there. You're gonna love it. They're beautiful overall, but they also include some really beautiful verbs. On that page, you can also sign up for my email list, which only covers how to write sentences. It's a fascinating series of emails. You'll love it. Once again, link in the description below. The third step to writing a dynamite sentence is to pick a power word. So when I was doing graduate studies at USC, I studied with Janet Fitch, who's probably best known for her novel White Oleander. Great teacher, I learned so much from her, and this is a tip I got from her. She recommended that every single sentence that you write have one power word. Basically, a word that elevates that sentence from being a mere conveyor belt of information into something a little more unusual and surprising. So let's look at some examples of that. This is a sentence from James Salter. She had a rich, naked laugh. Now, what do you think the power word is there? I would say it's naked, right? I don't think of laughs as being naked. But what I love about that word is it describes something about the laugh which is very unguarded. She doesn't care who hears her laugh, right? It's completely unself-conscious. Here's an example from Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. I am grateful for all those dark years, even though in retrospect, they seem like a long, bitter prayer. Now, what do you think the power word is there? I would argue that it's bitter. I love how bitter and prayer are fighting with each other a little bit. Like, you don't normally think of prayer as being a really bitter thing, and that's why it's really surprising. And then here's a sentence from Flann O'Brien. The road ran away westwards in the mist of the early morning, running cunningly through the little hills. What do you think the power word is in that sentence? I think it's cunningly. Cunningly is great because, one, it's mirroring the word before it. They both have that U-N-N-I-N-G, but I also like this personification of the road. It's not just a road which is sitting there, it is deliberately taking action. It is running cunningly. Like, you get a sense of these twists and turns of the road. Now, I am not telling you to use like a synonym to try to find like crazy words out there. I think it's best when it usually happens organically. And I'm also not telling you to choose complex words. If you look at these words, naked, bitter, cunningly, I mean, they're not super complex or super esoteric words. And I should also say, like, if there is a sentence you really, really love and you've always like stared at it and loved it and put it up on a pedestal on your bookshelf, then I want to hear about it. Please leave it in the comments below so we can have this like repository of amazing sentences. And here is step number 4 to write a killer sentence. Create a story arc. The purpose of this step is to get you to think about sentences as being mini stories. In other words, you should think about your sentences transporting you from the beginning of the sentence, and you should end up in a different place by the end of the sentence. The beginning of the sentence is basically setting up expectations that by the end you want to invert or subvert or fulfill in some way. And I absolutely love this example from Michel Houellebecq. It's just a gem of a sentence. It's from his book, The Elementary Particles. He was still a handsome man with a tanned, chiseled face and long, thick, wavy white hair, but his cells had begun to reproduce in a haphazard fashion, destroying the DNA of neighboring cells and secreting toxins into his body. Did I not warn you? That was going to be an incredible sentence. Okay, so we have the first half of the sentence. We think, oh, it's just like a description of a guy. No big deal. We see his face, we see his hair, like this is really like normal run-of-the-mill stuff. And then the cancer part of the sentence takes over. But it doesn't just say like, oh, by the way, he has cancer. It describes it in a very scientific manner, like cells reproducing in haphazard fashion, DNA getting messed up. So the beginning of that sentence is a guy who's an everyday Joe, right? Nothing remarkable about him. By the end of the sentence, we have a man dying from cancer. This next example is from Yaa Gyasi's book, Transcendent Kingdom. When I first started studying the neutral circuits of reward-seeking behavior in mice, I didn't believe they could feel fear, but I would come to understand that they could feel everything: fear, relief, joy, desire, disgust, all of it running like current through their tiny mouse bodies, just the same as it runs through mine. At the beginning of this sentence, we have a scientist doing experiments on mice. There is a clear gap between the woman and the creature. But by the end of the sentence, by that very surprising last phrase, we realize that there's a lot that they have in common. That's a journey. That sentence takes readers on a journey. Now, I have to say that not every sentence is going to do this. You shouldn't feel the pressure of trying to make every sentence do this, but I do think it's a very helpful way to think about how to make sure your sentence is pulling its weight and really captivating the reader, is making something change, making the story arc happen. The fifth step in writing a knockdown sentence is choose your figure of speech. Now, no, not every sentence needs a figure of speech, but a lot of beautiful, great sentences do include some kind of figure of speech. So I don't want to talk about metaphor and simile because you guys are smart, right? You already know what those are. So let's skip over that and get to some more complex, more surprising ones. Let's look at metonymy, which is basically when one word is substituted for another word. Here's an example from The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. He shall think differently, the musketeer threatened, when he feels the point of my steel. So instead of saying the word sword, right, instead he substitutes it for something that represents the word sword, steel. That's metonymy, folks. You probably use it and haven't even realized you've used it. And here is an example of synecdoche from John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. You know how the hands are. They just come in and get their bunk and work a month. So the synecdoche in that sentence is hands. And what it is just when you substitute a part for the whole, right? Now he just says hands, but he doesn't actually mean like an actual physical hands. I don't know what that was. He means like a hand as a symbol of, you know, a person, a whole person working on the farm. The most important part of that person are their hands, right? That's how they do all their farm work. And so that is a word that substitutes for the whole. Here are two figures of speech which are super important and that you need to use like actually quite frequently. Anaphora and epistrophe, and these are opposites. Anaphora is when you repeat a word at the beginning of a phrase. And I love this example from Karen Russell's Swamplandia. Our mother performed the Roadshow Gator Warrior act in front of 2,000 people, 5 days a week, 4 times a day, and afterwards she showed me how to do it too. How to hold your breath and rise from the lake like a goddess, how to hold very still in the cage, how to smile in such a way that your smile tells people they are lucky to be watching you die. So there's actually two examples of anaphora in that. One is a near example of anaphora. We have numbers at the beginning. 2,000 people, 5 days a week, 4 times a day. That's not exactly anaphoric because it's not exactly the same word, but it's close. And then the second half of the sentence has actual anaphora. How to hold your breath. How to hold very still. How to smile in such a way. And epistrophe is the opposite, where you end each part of the sentence with a similar word. Here's an example from The Wasp Eater. At the bottom of everything, they were a family of silence. Nothing but blind, black, coal-crumbling silence. His father never anchored or steady like his mother never sanguine or loose like his father. So I love that repetition of the word silence at the end of those initial two phrases. It really creates this sort of music, this sort of rhythm, the repetition of the word. Another figure of speech you should be using in your sentences is antithesis. Here's an example from Cormac McCarthy's The Road. You forget what you want to remember, and you remember what you want to forget. It's such a neat parallelism, and it's just flipped over a little bit, right? The two halves of the sentence are mirrors of one another. I'd also encourage you to use hyperbole and litotes, which I always want to read as litotes, but that's not how you say it. These are also opposites. Here's an example of hyperbole from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. At that time, Bogota was a remote, lugubrious city where an insomniac rain had been falling since the beginning of the 16th century. So the rain wasn't really falling continually since the 16th century, right? I mean, that's clearly an exaggeration, but I love how it like sets the tone and the mood of this story. Like it feels in the city like a rain has been falling for 4 centuries. And here's an example of a litotes from the classic Beowulf. The sword wasn't useless to the warrior. Well, duh, the sword just killed Grendel. I'd say it's actually pretty dang useful. But that figure of speech of underplaying something, which is the opposite of hyperbole, works really well sometimes. And the last figure of speech you should be using is repetition. It is very difficult to retrain our brains, which have been lectured to by high school English teachers saying, oh, don't repeat things. Well, I mean, don't be redundant, but redundancy is different than repetition. Repetition can be really beautiful. I mean, music is founded on repetition. Here's a great example of repetition from Anne Patchett's The Patron Saint of Liars. So I said yes to Thomas Clinton and later thought I had said yes to God and later still realized I had said yes only to Thomas Clinton. I said yes, I said yes, I said yes. But the story also takes us on a journey. She thought she was saying yes to a boy and then thinks, oh no, I was just following God's commands, and then realized, no, I was just going after a boy. I actually have a post on Bookfox which which is all about using repetition in sentences and how to do it well and how not to screw it up. I'll also put a link to that in the description below. The sixth and final step to writing a brilliant sentence is cut the fat. Now, I had initially written that as cut away the fat, and then I decided, what if I do what I'm telling other people to do and kill the away? And I think cut the fat is just nice and direct, so I'll stick with that. So what are things that you can cut away in a sentence so that what remains is highlighted? One, always have a keen eye for adjectives and adverbs. Sometimes you can pile up too many in a sentence that ends up cluttering the prose rather than illuminating what you should concentrate on, which is primarily nouns and verbs. Those are the engines of a sentence. That's what powers sentences. The second thing you should cut is prepositional phrases, particularly if you have, say, 3 or 4 in a row. It's just way too much. In my bed, under the covers, with my pillow was a sword. The in and the under and the with, that's 3 in a row prepositional phrases. It's usually not the best technique unless you're really trying to go for some sort of like prepositional phrase pile up. The third step in trying to cut the fat is just to trim unnecessary words. They collaborated together on the project. Well, could they collaborate alone? I think not. So cut that together, man, right? They collaborated on the project. Simpler, more direct. That's how you want to do it. And the very last step in cutting the fat is don't be afraid of short sentences. Like, they are not something to fear. I see a lot of authors, they are never having like a 3-word sentence in their book. And that's a shame. Like, if you don't have a 3-word sentence in your book, there's a problem with your book. You should have at least one. And if you don't believe me, hey, watch my video on short sentences. Hopefully that will convince you of the absolute genius of writing extremely short sentences.